Greetings, ladies and gents, and welcome to the batch video for the web novel Thieves Dungeon from the website Royal Road. This video will contain chapters 1.37 to 1.40, and as always, I hope that you enjoy. Chapter 1.37, Pick Your Poison. Adventurers arrived at my western border that night. They set up camp on the edge of the ravine, going no further. One of them, a bald man with a too big head and a too small neck, perched on the edge and sent out what little flecks with his hand, bobbing wisps of light. They flew out from him like roaming eyes, peering through every crack and crevice of the ravine's downward slope. As I watched through a rat my own wandering eye, he shambled back to his companions, and they began to sketch maps from his description. It seemed like they planned to scout the dungeon rather than to actually try and conquer it. Unfortunately, that's what I last saw. A man jumped forward like a spider and caught the rat, swinging it against the stone. I was broken free of my link through argent and the rodent's eyes with a rude jolt. In the end, I decided to leave them be where they were. The big event was coming up, and they were only a small distraction. I had already completed my gazebo, lifting up 2 layers of brilliant ice-white frosted glass in tall columns and round 2-tiered roof. The upper layer was Cogbachon's personal den, while the lower was rapidly becoming a workshop of sorts as we discovered one thing after another that he would need to begin his work for me. It turned out that being able to conjure things out of thin air had made me shockingly numb to how much effort humans put into such acts as creation. All the fiddly workings and skills that went into something like a jeweled cap. Something of the tools the coach needed was something so specific that I couldn't even create them. But he was fascinated by the process and quietly delighted by me shaping his tools out of thin air and manner. So I continued until he had a little workshop. Sophie's goblet had a long table near the center, surrounded by imitations. I had done a fair job of faking the gems with the common crystals, and of replicating the border strokes of her work. But anyone with a refined eye could tell which one was the original. At least they could if they had a strong enough mind to resist the attunement of gleam within the glass vault, where every light scattered into hundreds of refractions. This was a challenge of the vault. To depart this room, the law shall be, you must choose the goblet and drink its contents. We had no shortage of poisons to fill the imitations with, deadly and merely debilitating, painful and disgusting ways to die. There was a cornucopia of wrong choices to make. A true cup was merely filled with brackish water. Sophie's blood had been washed away. I realized something important. She had come to me. Giving me blood was a good way of putting the burden on me to make a decision. But far from being now or never, I had the luxury of waiting her out. She would make a second offer soon. Now her masterpiece served as a part of my dungeon, and the vault itself set over the entrance of the stairwell, hiding it from plain sight. I'd used the nacre spider split to weave the solid trapdoor out of the carefully colored mosses, so that the intruders, if they got this far, could literally step on her without noticing. Considering that was down here and I was almost doing them a favor, I still found myself struck by moments of seething rage, where it was like I was witnessing that horrible moment all over again. But they were distinct, contained moments now, flashes of anger. They did not disrupt my work. I was a dungeon core. Nothing could be allowed to disrupt my work. As I finished the touches on my first vault, my ratty spies in the market informed me that the workers were swarming to and from, lifting up a stage from the auction, setting up a grand event. That meant people moving through the tunnels, a Byzantine labyrinth that I had come to know like the facet of my own cause. One by one, men started to go missing, pulled into the dark. Giant spiders were seen, and just as importantly, as the workers started to avoid the tunnels where the arachnid terrors were spotted, what I was really up to wasn't seen. Huge pale grubs burrowed into the earth as the caustic spit, turning the stone soft and chewing it away. I designed them specifically for the task. By tomorrow they would be dead, eaten by their own acidic stomach fluids. They were more living tools than true creatures. For the longest time, the Nacra spiders had been confined to relatively small nests, unable to branch out and expand. Now the eager adolescents would have their chance to set nests of their own. By tomorrow night these tunnels would be riddled with secret nests, with hidden doorways to death. Of the people who came to see the auction, how many would die on the way, pulled into the opulent, lavish larder of the eight-legged beauties? How many would simply vanish down here in the dark? One thing concerned me: none of my spies had yet to see so much as a hair of a unicorn. Elbar sat in his cage, miserable and confused. For the first time in his life he wasn't sure why he was alive. The taskmasters had told him he lived to work. His father had said that he'd live for the chance of freedom. The dungeon had simply ignored him. The weight of doing nothing every day as his people waited to be rescued was crushing. They should have sent someone better. He had eaten all the mushrooms he could reach through the glass bars of his prison. His belly grumbled and growled. The boy felt strange, a thrumming energy beneath his skin. Despite being only able to walk from one end of the cage to the other, he felt stronger than ever before, hungrier, hawkish. He felt hawkish. There was a fire building beneath his skin. He drank in the air of the dungeon. This was home. He only needed to make the dungeon understand that. Rolling onto his belly, he stuck his hand through the cage and reached desperately for a mushroom, his fingers just barely able to scrape its edges. A shadow loomed over him. It was a man and was a spider, joined together at the hips, pale white armor that reflected the light of the slick rings and rainbow covered nearly every inch of the flesh, except the face. The fingertips extended into bladed claws, the legs raking the earth as it moved. "I am Kobo-chan," the creature said. "Ilber, son of Rosk. I've come to—" Ilber was ready to beg to give him an improved, revised version of his speech, but Kobo-chan just raised a hand. "I know. I think you will succeed." I'd opened up a palm, revealing a small emerald. "But first you must eat this." Eat it? Ilber would have much rather had a mushroom. Yes, to see if your kind can become connected to the maker. If not, then there is no hope. With a shaking hand, Ilber reached in and took the gem, turning it over in the light before placing it in his tongue. A swallow and... He screamed. The jewel burned on the way down, igniting a fire. Ilber bent double, clutching at his throat, feeling the flame descend to his belly. His head ached and ached as thoughts not his own were pouring in. The boy thought that he was dying. Just the opposite. A voice spoke to him. You are earning a chance to live. The silent market began with men and women making excuses from their families, or padding down the stairs from rented rooms with masks and cloaks tucked under their arm. They slid into the sewers by well-worn roofs marked with jumbles of thief signs, pausing in the shadows to don the required clothes to fix their masks into place. And then they set out, fingers scraping on the walls to pick up half-faded signs that would guide them, or simply so familiar that they could walk their way there in the dark. Not all of them made it that night. Many stories ended with a flash of nacre-coated claws, a scream, a cut short, and a click of the trapdoor closing. Others simply passed on by, safe in numbers or simply lucky enough to have caught the moment when the spider was still spinning its last meal into a nefarious coffin. By the time they arrived at the market, there was a sense of wrongness in the air. The atmosphere of suspicion and appointments were missed, and familiar masks failed to show. In the early hours, the stall still was setting up, a stage still being assembled. It was only a warming worry at the back of the mind. Nothing anyone gave too much attention to. But there was a palpable sense of relief as the stage had completed without incident, and an audible sigh as the Under-Queen Emma's private barge was seen sailing down the river. They thought everything was going according to plan, and it was. Just a different plan than they were expecting. End of chapter 1.38. The Serpentine. We watched, we waited. Argent was we now, in the imperial presence that joined the minds of the dungeon rats into one. She didn't rule by force, she had no power to bend their minds to her will. but she had a story to tell, and it went like this. They were very small, their lives were defined by it, too small to fight back when predators took their food, too small to claim a part of the world for their own. They were hated, the humans pushed them out, regulated them to a life in the filth of the sewers, and in the city with so much they were left chewing on scant rinds and bones in the shadows. But they were many, and there were thousands of rats in Coltern, if not tens of thousands. Together they could demand a place at the table. Together they could force the human world to acknowledge them and take their fair share. It was a good story. It was spoken not in words but raw emotions, stirring the dreams of rich food and resentment for days of starvation that lived in every rat's heart. The anger of the seeing plenty around them while they snuffled in the gutters for scraps. For them, tonight was a night of revolution. It didn't take long for the auction to become my personal hell. I had figured out a way to steal the unicorn, yes, but not to swipe everything else up for bidding, which meant watching an entire parade of treasures slip by without being able to claim them. You cannot imagine the agony. First up was the enormous slab of twisted red coral. It attracted immediate interest. Bidders lifted their hands and put down the first thousands, then tens of thousands. It was sold off to a fat man in a childlike mask, who I swore I'd find and kill some day. The next item was a less beautiful, and consequently of less interest to me. An oil painting stolen from some deceased Grand Master of the arts, a lute filled with silence of beautiful humming melody in the moment that attendant touched the strings. The enchanted sword of baleful, book-soaked aura that made me shiver. A set of china made from sphinx bones. I froze. The audience gasped, and I was simply shocked. A sphinx? Lay my hands on one piece of that set, and I could have a sphinx. It took so much discipline to hold myself back from setting my plan into motion then and there. I had the best seats in the house, and watched from the tops of the tents of the stalls. I had another vantage point as well. Down amongst the crowd a strange, rugged man stood, his body seeming to wriggle as tiny movements shifted beneath his clothes. He walked oddly, clumsily, as if he had no bones. I restrained myself as the china was set and put aside, and the next lot brought up. To my surprise, it was a golem. Segmented bands and plates of black iron formed its body, the design giving it a strange mobility, the central core built into its visor of a monolithic eye. That was when Sufi arrived. The market burst into a sound around her, the guards rushing towards her company of dwarves, because none of them wore masks. Their clothing was ripped and torn, their bloody cuts beneath. One dwarf limping theatrically with the shaft of a poleaxe as a crutch. "Emma, you slime, get out here!" she roared, her personal soldiers fending off the guards and pushing the crowd apart so that she could stomp to the fore. This was an ambush. The crowd was already unsettled, knowing that not all of them had made it tonight. Her words were like a match tossed into a ready kindling. The fires of suspicion were lit, and whispers started to travel through the crowd, growing in volume in defiance of the guards. I had given her a role to play, and she was playing it with abandon. "Silence in the market!" The attendant, a man in black harlequin mask who had announced the auction began with, cried. "Silence from the crowd! Oh, shove it! Emma, get your maggot-ridden ass out on stage!" Sufi shouted, hurling her axe at the clown. He dived aside and the blade slammed into the pillar of the stage behind him. It was a disaster, but my attention was drifting, pulled away from the delightful performance by my spies elsewhere in the market, my scurrying legion of informants. I saw everything within the market at once. My eyes were legion. We had found the unicorn. My wallflower rats, the rodents that I had given the suckered feet to climb any surface with, and the lone web weaver vermin who crawled across the ceilings and Emma's barge, following guards through the dark undercroft of the ship to cage. Inside the unicorn lay. It scraped its horn against the bars in a constant rasping sound. It was nothing like what I imagined. It was pitch-black fur covered in bold patches and biting fleas. It was a shameful specimen, weakened to the point of death. The outcropping of white bones covered the muzzle and a neutral armored helm. obscuring everything but the eye, just one. The other lost, gouged out in some catastrophic battle. The bladed spike rose from the brow, as sharp as any sword. More erupted from the ridge of its spine, making the horse that could never be ridden, never be tamed. It had an eagle-feathered hindquarters and claws, each talon deadly a weapon. Captivity had reduced this beast to a sack of skin and bones, barely alive. But it was beautiful, nonetheless. I could see the bearings of a proud warrior, in the way it snorted and glared at the gods. Hooves and claws stamping on the floorboards, and its keen single eye even caught sight of the vermin scuttling over their heads, staring curiously at my creations as they gathered over its cage. Emma sat on a stool beside the cage, keeping personal watch. He picked his fingernails with a long curved knife and drank from a sealed bottle. "Captain Emma, Sir Sufi Holfhand is here. Without a mask, she's calling you out." "Tch!" he hissed through his teeth, flicking his fingers as the guard to go away. "Let her. People are riled up, so they're saying that you've been ambushing people on the way to the market." With a sigh, Emma rose from his seat. At the same moment, my jeweled spider was descending on the silver thread, steadily rappelling down to bite the unicorn. Its poison had been modified to cause a brief but death-like symptoms, enough to force them to take it to the doctor without causing lasting harm. Emma's hand shot out and crushed it. Broken legs struck out from his fingers, twitching in the last. Scraping his glove clean on the wall, Emma sighed. "Let's go, then, you two. Bring the beast. We'll start the sale now and put an end to this." I was in shock. Of course, I had created a second spider, yes, but it was minutes away. My window of timing was now, before the unicorn was escorted to the stage. Emma was walking towards the stairs, its attention turning away. The guards were more occupied with the unicorn, which was snarling and bracing to fight as they approached the cage, whinnying in anger. There was one last chance to put a plan back into order. The web-weaver vermin scuttled across the ceiling, spinning out a banner of silk that connected to words. "Play sick." 2 words, the prayer the beast that could even read. The unicorn looked up, and hesitating for a moment as the guards unlatched the cage door. As they gasped for the bridle and clamped on its jaw, it let out a sudden cry of fake pain, and collapsed, body shaking in the bars of the cage as it sprawled against them. Emma turned. The tiny flag of words had already been reeled back up, my creation safely hidden amongst the shadows and the corners where they met the ceiling. "Oh, damn it," he growled, as he crossed the floor, kicking the unicorn in the flanks. The creature let out a weak huff of pain. "Oh, damn it!" In a moment he had gone from an assured and cruel-like cat to a madman, striking out at the guards, whipping at them with the hilt of his dagger as they lifted their hands to protect their faces. "You two, get the doctor now," he ordered, and I could have cheered. The pirate captain stomped up the stairs, heading for the confrontation with Sufi, where I was ready with a day's second surprise. The 2 guards looked at each other and then leaned down, awkwardly trying to lift up the supposedly sick horse back onto its feet to lead to the doctor. And not too far away, the dark passage that carried the river beneath the Colturn's foundations, oars dipped into the water. My golem ship and my grand creation, the Serpentine, was ready to sail. End of chapter. Chapter 1.39. The Night of White Fires. It was a tinderbox atmosphere. The crowd was seething, shoving against itself in a directionless fervor of anger and fear. Not everyone believed Sufi's accusation, but everyone knew something was wrong here. And more of them were choosing to slip away, not wanting to be there when the axe finally fell. That was when the mood as Emma vaulted onto the stage, Long Jacket trailing behind him. "People, people," he cried, holding his hands out. "What is this nonsense I hear? From a dwarf who can't even follow the rules of our market, no less." His self-assurance failed to calm the crowd Sufi had stirred up against him. Handsome smiles and smug charisma were all well and good when people were already on your side, but they made him look untrustworthy now. In a wary and paranoid atmosphere, his oozing confidence made him the outsider. "Freck your rules, Emma. "You have my people's blood on your hands," Sufi yelled back, and the crowd lifted their voice in echo. "Frick your rules." "Any proof of that? Any proof at all?" Emma demanded, mouth twisted up into a furious skull. His smiling face was thin as paper. One thing went wrong, I noticed, and he turned from charm to rage. Am I supposed to defend myself from idiots' baseless accusations? It was the wrong thing to say. I couldn't have been more delighted than to watch him flounder, trying to manipulate the strange, fickle moods of the humanity and running right into a war of hatred. It was already too late for him. I had my cloth golem disguised as just another hooded figure in the crowd, signed to its neighbor, "Where's the unicorn?" The question caught on like a wildfire as soon as enough I was hearing the hold on the stage, as Emma started to pace back and forth. "You lot! Have I ever done anything but dutifully tend to this market? Have I ever betrayed any of you?" His face was ugly with red and fury. I saw the familiar face of the Storm Cormorant's captain surface amongst the crowd, clapping his hands to his mouth to shout, "Yes, you have, you two-faced bastard!" That was when it happened. The first of the blazing flash of light, and then the darkness spread across the market. It was time. My little spies had brought back a phosphorus skin carefully bundled by a rat-sized bundle, wrapped in airproofed wax. They piled them into the corner of the market within an empty stack of crates, and carefully spilled open the first package. As it touched the air, it let off a pale glow that was the beginnings of an ignition. And as the bloom of white flame roared above the market, crackling and flickering with spitting of sparks, the rats moved. In the crowd, the cloth golem collapsed into an empty pile of clothes as rodents poured out from within. Dozens of them leapt out in the ragman, carrying with them pouches of night vein and dust as they burst apart in clouds of darkness. They were like the tendrils of shadows, reaching out to close their gap in the market, and all the light swallowed up by the billowing grey powder. Soon it was a dark tomb. Rats were everywhere. They rose from the sewers and from the shadows, stealing openly from the stalls. In the sudden dark there was nobody to stop them as they snatched up everything that shone. Others were close behind. Not thieves, but fire-starters. They carried packets of phosphor and scattered the blazing powder across the stalls, merchandise the guards. More flames reared up, their brilliance briefly pushing back the dark. They were a pale vivid flames of the color of bone, the world rendered in black and white. I had planted the seeds of the beautiful chaos, and to his credit, Emma knew immediately what the true goal was. "Guards, to the ship now!" In his ruin, he had just ordered his men on a collision course with the panicking, furious crowd that he'd stirred into a furor against him. In the deathly gloom spread as the night vein powder, there was no coordination, only animalistic fear. As they hit the front line of the fleeing people, truncheons were swung, swords drawn, and the markets erupted into a riot. Sufi and her soldiers were just the first into the fray. Indiscriminate with whether they were cutting down the market's guards or customers, they pushed both factions away as they swept out with their polearms, hacking open flesh and bringing out screams. And all the while the Serpentine was coming up the river, oars slicing through the water as the green sail bellowed in an invisible wind. Blood-red timber was rushing bronze-clad sides with a sleek vessel. The night vein figurehead swallowed the light as it passed by the moored ships in the market flotilla, snuffing out their lanterns one by one. Aboard the Under Queen, without their captain, the first mate was laying about with a whip trying to keep order. "Swords out, eyes sharp, where did that fricking unicorn go?" Because it was already gone, hauled to the doctor's tiny vessel at the edge of the market. Only a skeleton crew of guards had followed along, leaving it poorly defended, with the chaos in the market keeping anyone from rushing to reinforce. My golem ship was atrim and fast as it cut through the water, the Under Queen's many lights going dark as it rushed past like a shadow. Who knows what the guards stationed there thought, seeing the deathly ship pass them in the night white fires, crewed by a single figure. All I knew is that they panicked, and not even the first mate's whip could keep them under control. We came upon the doctor's ship, and the fallen golem leapt onto the deck of the Serpentine to the little cutter with the clack of his hooves. Before the guards could even cry out, his spear had pierced the first of them through the throat. The second managed to scream before the blade was shoved aside and the spear took him in the chest. The third man, to his honor, got as far as swinging his blade down before the thorn twisted, using his horns to deflect the blow and flicking a tip of his spear into the man's throat with an open line dripping red. The haft spun and smacked the fourth dumb across the head. One more thrust and one more kill, and they were clear. The glass column stepped down the stairs to the lower deck, where the doctor cowered, the unicorn lay in chains, shackles keeping it from moving its legs in a more than a hard-built trot. The swing of the glass spear against the chains couldn't break them. Sparkwork flashed against the metal and repelled the spear tip. It wouldn't stop us. The unicorn let out a humiliated bray as it was hefted like a sack of potatoes over the golem's shoulders, the diminutive form struggling to take on the stairs with the horse slug over its back. The tips of their horns scraped on the stairwell as the doctor shivered and sucked from his flask in the shadows. Emma would probably kill the old fool. Not my concern. The plan had gone off without a hitch, and now we merely needed to get away. Already, the first wave of ragged guards were rushing across the web of gangplanks and bridges that connected the moored merchant ships in the market's harbor. They were coming for the Serpentine with torches and swords and axes and spears. That was when the ship started to sink. For days now my rats had gnawed open the underside of the hulls, and now, one by one, they broke through, ripping the louse-ridden timbers apart to let the water rush through. The guards went tumbling over the decks as they stood on the pitched and lurched diagonal tilt, beginning to sink. The rope bridges snapped as one of the other ships began to pull away. Another layer of chaos. The glass golem laid the unicorn down on the deck of the golem ship, turning back to face a few men who had made over the scuttle of ships. They had weapons, yes, but nothing that could pierce the glass flesh. He simply waded through them, striking them left and right, and claiming lives with every sweep of his spear. But now that things started to go wrong. The spellwork chains on the unicorn's legs were starting to glow hot, the runic letters peeling off the iron to rise into the air above. They joined into a circling swarm that let out a high-pitched scream, alerting the entire market that what we were doing. The Serpentine was pulling away now, oars beating in reverse. But as I watched from dozens of ratty eyes, a figure lifted from the deck of the Underqueen. A mage floated into the sky, lifted by rotating diagram under his feet, chains of golden letters wrapping around his tattooed arms. They had a wizard. End of chapter. 1.40 The Underqueen. Ice knocked against the Serpentine's hull as the mage began to cast, congealing the waters of the river into a razor-sharp flows. The golem ship twisted and turned to evade the frigid spikes the size of tree trunks as it burst from the river bottom. In the narrow confines of the underground river, it moved like no other ship could, almost dancing across the still waters, an invisible wind filling its sails. But the salvo wasn't over. Enormous stalactites of ice formed and arched the ceiling of moss and its spragged brickwork above, plummeting down. The water exploded in sprays of green as they came hurtling down, and one crashed against the deck, tearing deep to rend the Serpentine's armored sides. We raced for the light at the end of the tunnel, where the river emerged back into the dimming twilight sky and split as it headed towards the seas. We could outrun any ship ever made by human hands on open waters. I was sure of it. The mind of the Serpentine was simple and clear, and thrilled at the thought of sky, of wind, of new waters to cut its handsome prow through. She laughed with glee and roared with anger as she danced through the mage's first volley, only to be caught by the next. And still he wasn't done. With us slowing now, bent and crooked waters flooded the breach as it weighed us down. He cast out chains of golden runic characters that wrapped around the oars and bound them, moving like the tendrils of a kraken to weigh us down. A fiery halo surrounded him, metal fragments wreathed in flames circling his head. They came spluttering down on the decks in bursts of sparks as they shattered timber, peppering the deck, tearing the sails. He was gaining. The glass golem lifted his spear as the mage rushed into range. A sudden high-pitched note sung out through the air, rising and rising into the unbearably sharp crystalline hum. For a second all the mage's spellwork faltered, and the runic diagram he flew through in the air failed. He tumbled down, and the glass golem was already running towards the rear of the deck, lifting his spear. He vaulted onto the railings and through. The glass spear sailed through the air in a perfect arc, and at the last moment the mage lifted a hand, conjuring a half-shell of densely interlocked characters that deflected the spear in a scrape of brilliant sparks. He landed on a platform of ice that lifted up out of the water to catch him. We were floundering now, although the moment of distraction had let us burst through the golden chains. Fire still clung to our sails, eating ever larger holes in the living mast and making the whole ship shudder with pain. Letters danced around the mage's hands as he wove intricate, complex designs with his fingers, readying another spell. This one would be a crippling blow. The glass ball leapt over the side, landing unbalanced on one hand, clinging to the bottom of the railing on one foot, balanced against the faint seam between the armored plates. With the boat slowly twisting, he left it impossible for the mage to see him there. He reached out and snapped the oar free of the ship, breaking away the paddled end and leaving the sharp, splintered tips. The mage wove his spelled work tighter and tighter, forming a sphere of golden light that blazed within his hands. In the second he let go, he threw it towards the serpentine. The glass column kicked off from the ship's hull, and as he crossed into the view of the mage, he hurled his makeshift spear. The spell flying towards us came undone in a spluttering drift of loose characters as the wooden pole smashed through the mage's chest. Blood dripped down from his robes as his mouth hung open like a fish. The glass column crashed into the water. The Under-Queen had pulled away from its moorings. The oars beat the water in tune with a great drum. The crack of the bullwhip against the oarsman's back. Captain Nimmer was coming for us, and although this barge was clumsy and slow, made for pleasure, our ship was brutally damaged, and a brief encounter with his pet sorcerer. They took the ground with every beat of oars. Water was rushing in through the wounded side, weighing us down, our course wobbling from the lack of oars along the one side. We were barely approaching the light of the tunnel when the first ropes were cast over the side. Guards in black iron masks climbed aboard and jumped down from the barge's mast, landing on an empty deck. The golem ship needed no sailors, no crew. What it had instead was an army. From below came crawling up a giant spider after giant spider. The first man to turn and run, he died as a bone harpoon shot out and pierced him through the chest. The rest of them got to watch as he was dragged back, his trailing feet leaving his body smears against the great eight-legged horror that had seized him and reeled him in line with the cleaver legs, finishing him off with a skull-crunching bite. That put fear in them. Kobachon, first of the Arachne, rose to the head of the war band, wearing armor that he'd made himself from worked nacre as I infused him with mana to strengthen. With a helm across his face, with no longer any trace of humanity to him, his armoring shone like the grandest of pearls as it deflected the crossbow bolt and broke a sword. His hand swept out and his fingertips pierced through the man's cheek, nearly ripping his face off with a simple raking touch. And the ship rocked with the battle unfolded, Emma crying, "Forward! Forward!" From the rear of his first mate lashed the men balking, slowly trying to retreat. The ones that went overboard found the waters below swarming with my real fish. It was bloody brutal, and it wasn't easy. The men on Emma's private guard were battle-hardened and stronger than humans should be, able to hack through the plate of the necro spiders with their hatchets and cutlasses. They died by the dozens, torn down by blade limbs, but they took as well as they gave. Only numbers and the close quarters were letting us push them back. Slowly. Slowly. I almost didn't see him move. He was like a shadow flying over the heads of men, over the backs of spiders. In one leap he was streaking across the deck of a long blurred arc as the dagger in his hand flashed down, aimed at Kobachon's throat. The Arachne lifted his hands and the blade went directly through his palm. his fingers crushing down, ripping apart Emma's fingers where they gripped the blade's hilt. Daggers, fingers, blood red and yellow, they all hit the deck as Emma fell back, narrowly rolling to evade the swipe of Kobuchun's blade-tipped legs. Coins clattered to the floor, silver and gold, Emma's real weapons. Rings bedecked his remaining fingers, and he reached out, empty-handed, as if they began to shine with a greedy light. The coins flashed like tiny stars. The men were retreating now, running from their captain. They knew what was to come next. The mana in the air was sucked in, forming violet whirlpools of currents that collapsed as into blazing gold, the shining silver. His hands moved alight with dancing colors of metallic fire, and the rings drained mana from the ship, from the spiders. My 8-legged beauties began collapsing, snuffed out by the dissolving of the mana that made up their flesh and stolen, leaving only drifts of ashy stuff behind. Kobuchun's armor peeled from him like leaves coming loose from the autumn tree. He opened his finger and let a single petal fly from his hand, lifted by the swirling currents of the air. It was the very last petal of the divine flower, the messenger they had left behind. A flower made of the purest divine mana. It ignited, becoming a cloud of golden fire. The fire was pulled into the mana-devouring currents towards Emma's fingertips. Tiny tendrils of flame split from the cloud of the lightning bolt to strike each of the coins that it had turned into greedy mana sinks, turning them into molten dots of metal steaming on the deck of the serpentine. The main mass of brilliant divine mana descended to touch the outstretched hand. Emma ignited. His hand was melted away, the superheated rings falling through the flesh like hot knives through butter, while his long hair ignited like a wick of a candle. He screamed and stumbled, hurtling himself for the railings. The burning shadow of Emma hit the water and did not come back. The oars pushing against the water, the ropes binding us to the Underqueen snapped as we lurched free. They had seen divine fire smite the captain, and all their willingness to chase us down was gone with him. We sailed through the arched entrance to the river tunnel and out into the coming night. The air cool upon the charred sails, how wonderful how! The pull of the river strengthened, urging us on. The day was won, the prize was ours. End of chapter. And that concludes this batch video. I hope that you enjoyed. If you wish to support the channel, there are numerous ways to do so down below. Until next time, I hope that you all have a good one. And I'll see you all in the next video. Cheers.